Okay, hi everyone. This is Rachel from MENA S&R, and today I am really excited for our conversation. We are speaking with the director of the Middle East Center and an associate professor of history and sociology of science at the University of Pennsylvania. And Harun, I will let you, as I just mentioned, introduce yourself more fully. I think our paths have crossed. I think we met at a conference many years ago, a history of science.
I think we have.
And I think we even tried to write a chapter proposal on having more reflections on religion in SDS or something like that at the time. But apparently we were ahead of our time, and now those subjects are more coming to the fore. So
Right.
In these conversations, we're basically speaking with scholars about their work, maybe even a little bit about how they came to their research. Your research in particular has a lot of intersections with things I've been interested in terms of different receptions of evolution. So it's pretty open and free-flowing. Feel free to begin wherever you want to begin about introducing what you're doing now, how you got there, and things along those lines. So welcome, first of all, Harun.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity for this conversation. And lovely seeing you again, albeit virtually. Let's see. So science and religion. I mean, see, if you're working on something like the Ottoman Empire or pretty much anywhere else in the Middle East, I think religion is really your primary analytic. That's how if you go into the history of science, usually you go in thinking about science and religion. And that was very much the case for me. And I guess my interest in like science and religion goes back to at least to my master's education at Sabancı University in Istanbul. But I think the first time I wrote anything serious about it was actually a seminar paper for Bob Westman. We had the science and religion research seminar, and the UC San Diego has these very nice arrangements where you have a 2-semester course. So first semester, you read things. So we read things about, Galileo affair and a whole bunch of other things. And the second semester, we wrote papers. And the paper I wrote later on became a published paper called Islam, Christianity, and Conflict Thesis. So that's, I would say, probably my initial sort of foray into the topic of science and religion. After that point, I taught science and religion for some years at the University of Pennsylvania. It was called Science and Religion Global Perspectives. And teaching that course taught me a whole bunch of very important things about, especially Darwin, but about like science and religion more generally. And that is, if you look at the reception of evolution across the globe, there is very little variation in how you react to it, whether you're Muslim, Buddhist, Christian. So it just made me wonder, so is religion the right analytic for this? And the moment I had that doubt, I kind of stopped teaching that course. So that was kind of like, my general episode of science and religion. And of course, like I still have a lot of questions about science and religion. One being the belief model, right? So this is something that's usually the bread and butter of most science and religion type things, right? You believe this one thing versus you believe this other thing. And the question I was left with, again, like, after like years of engaging with questions of science and religion, was the depth of belief and the role that belief plays in religion, which may or may not be very much. And there's a wonderful paper by Philip Kitcher on militant modern atheism. I don't know if you've read it, and I mean I think it's in an applied philosophy journal, and it's basically talking about Daniel Dennett and all these guys, and what they're saying about religion. And basically Philip Kitcher was saying, look, you're thinking about religion as a system of beliefs, whereas very few religious people actually have well articulated beliefs about about the things that you're putting into their mouths, and much less a strong commitment to those things. And he instead highlighted the role of community, the role of practice, why people say, may still continue to believe in God after having been shown that, nature is a competitive, ruthless kind of thing that seems to have no plan. And the solution he proposed was kind of like a Scandinavian model. If you can provide social safety to everybody and a fully satisfying secular education, equal opportunity and all to everybody, religion is going to stick around, and it's not going to necessarily stick around for belief types of reasons. So that kind of stuck with me. And in my own research, so I'm originally a 17th, 18th century Ottoman specialist. I've done work in other areas. And right now I'm kind of interested in the history of labor aspect of science. And what I found, and this is something that's kind of been an albatross on my neck, the question of Ottoman conservatism, the decline of science in Islam and things of that sort. And to my surprise, what I found was actually, the kinds of beliefs that we associate with high religion, say theological beliefs, and science actually feed from the same source. And if you take that source away, you lose both. And my understanding of systematic theology in Islam, it rests on the belief that this whole religion and this whole world kind of makes sense. There's a system of thought that will explain it all. Even that attempt is meaningful in a lot of ways, and not all religions have. In fact, most religions don't have anything approaching a systematic theology. They have these pockets of belief, and there are other pockets of practice. And I think a lot of people are just fine living a religion that's maybe a set of rules that may or may not hang together if you were to lay it out in a philosophical system. And that's kind of what I found in the Ottoman Empire. So people definitely, practiced religion, but I didn't find this conservatism, this anti-science sentiment that people who talk about the Islamic decline may like to find in a place like the Ottoman Empire, because that gives them it's a crutch, it's an explanation, whereas I didn't find any evidence to support that kind of explanation. So I don't know where that puts me. I mean, I think it puts me in the sort of the Headley Brook complexity ballpark, but maybe a little more towards practice rather than complexity of belief.
Well, that's really interesting. The conference we just had in this network was called Beyond Belief, and it was looking at issues of practice in communities and things along those lines. So it seems like we have a lot of common interests there. But if I do want to just go back a little bit more to your work on evolution, which I'm not sure if I understood exactly when you said you do find that the same reaction occurs everywhere. And
right.
When I've looked at it, it looks like there's a lot of variety of different cultural interpretations of evolution and ways that people are reacting to it. So I wasn't exactly sure what you meant about that. So,
well, here are a few elements I think that's really common across the board. So for one, Darwin is rarely read for his biology. I would say a couple of chapters from The Descent of Man, if you for pedagogical purposes, really takes you to the crux of the issue. I mean, otherwise, I don't think people are interested in the flora and fauna of Madagascar. They are not interested in, say, pigeon training pigeons, breeding pigeons, and things like that. And again, almost across the board, you don't get many people who are doing biological work that's kind of addressing the kinds of claims that Darwin is making. Most people are interested in this discursive element. And specifically, they are interested in this discursive element that has to do with competition in nature, and specifically among races. So, if you look at the example of, say, China, they are thinking about things like, are we hardworking? Are we lazy? Is our religion giving us a leg up, or is it hurting us? things of that sort. And you don't find people who are engaging with it in terms of like, doing biology, right? We are doing like, biological research, which seems to be in agreement with or in opposition to what like Darwin is doing. So there is a lot of talking about science and religion. There's a lot of talking about evolution, but the strictly scientific element is generally missing, and competition is there. People are always reading it through the lens of colonialism or the threat of colonialism. Those are the kinds of things that I found, which again, like, and I had these questions when I was reading Marwa Ali Shakri's excellent book, Reading Darwin in Arabic. Yes, people are reading Darwin in Arabic. They are talking about it in extremely intelligent ways, but nobody's really doing biology in a manner of speaking. At least, in the sources, that's not what we find. And I found that this is, generally true across the board, which made me wonder, so like, what are we really talking about when we talk about science and religion in the case of Darwin? Um, yeah, I think that's kind of like, that's been my impression, having taught it for some years.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear more about this class. Who are the students who are taking your classes? These sort of conversations are supposed to be available to graduate students and people who are interested in learning about the field. So if I understood you correctly, this was a subject that was of interest, and you feel like the subject has moved on a bit. If I understood a little bit of your thinking about it, that if you taught it today, you teach it differently than you would have taught it a decade ago, or.
I think absolutely I would. Absolutely I would. So this was an undergraduate class. It wasn't a graduate class.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of class attracts a certain kind of student who usually have a history of thinking about science and religion. And, without kind of like pointing any fingers, I would say, these are students who feel pointed at when the issue of science and religion is brought up. So, people who come from like conservative religious backgrounds, Catholic students, Jewish students, Muslim students, certain types of Protestant students, but this is usually the package. And also part of the package are people who are very committed atheists, people who might be like active on like Reddit forums on atheism and things like that, people who are active on social media, people who might be following Richard Dawkins on social media and things like that. So it's psychologically, I think it's a very interesting experience teaching a course like this, because in a way it's therapy. In a way it's therapy for people who've had trouble with thinking through these issues. And in that regard, it's always been an absolute joy teaching this. Just witnessing the class discussions and seeing what comes out of like students' mouths when they're discussing these things.
Yeah, and how were these different groups interacting? They were managing to understand that there might be different views on the subject and see the spectrum within the classroom as a positive thing. And because it could also be a big challenge to teach that if you're saying students are coming highly invested with a lot of sort of preconceived notions, and then maybe you're trying to present them with other perspectives, be they historical or sociological, in addition to philosophical or theological and things like that.
Right. So in that regard, so people who come in like looking for some like kind of vindication usually don't get it. So I try very hard to make my classes unsatisfying in that regard. But what I do, of course, is I give them a platform, which is the reading and the lecture associated with it, and they also get a civil platform for discourse. Which is very different from I think for this generation of students, it's all the more important, because civil disagreement, I think, is a key skill that college education can impart, and it's not what you get once you step outside of college. It's not a common trait that you find on the street. I don't know if it ever was, but I feel it very acutely when like people feel personally attacked when their opinions are attacked, which is not a good thing. But the idea is being able to like have a disagreement, have a go at it, just bring your best guns, to the fight in a way, but then walk away, having had a disagreement. And that's such a key thing, not just for like college students, I think for all of us, that it's an attack on our views does not necessarily mean an attack on our persons or anything like it. But yeah,
So
I
you
mean,
were
that's
facilitating some debates in some of these
yes,
conversations.
yes. And I used to assign, so I went to St. John's College, which is an odd kind of place in the United States. And there's a very nice piece called Notes on Dialogue by one of the founding figures of the college called Stringfellow Barr. And there, the idea is, well, how do we sort of facilitate discussion without, people starting to punch each other? How do we discuss things that are sensitive to people? And one way, and I haven't done this in class, but I think I would going forward. One thing that we did at St. John's was we all went by our last names. So, I'm Harun. I was never Harun in class. I was always Mr. Küçük, right? And that kind of gives you an idea of like, well, you can dissociate this kind of like public intellectual persona, of course, from who you are, right? The name you go by. But yeah, I think that's kind of like key. And in a manner of speaking, like, just looking at this from like a very high place, I think a class like Science and Religion is probably more valuable for what it teaches about civil discourse and like, a culture of disagreement than it does about either science or religion.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I've been getting more and more drawn into the concept of dialogue and how to talk across differences, and actually a lot of the approaches sound almost sort of the antithesis of the St. John's approach, in terms of it saying maybe some of the people have heard about these ideas in the abstract, be they very active atheists or very involved religious people, and when you meet the person that comes with the idea, that's going to give you a whole nother level of reaction, because you can always react negatively against an idea, but when you see the person and you actually attach the person to the idea, that is actually a very beneficial thing. So it's interesting that you could have these different approaches to civil discourse, maybe going in different directions. And I actually just wound up writing an article that's still under review right now. Just there's a special issue coming out on I don't know if you know Shoaib Malak's book on Malik's book on Islam and evolution that came out last year. So he had
I haven't read it, no.
Okay, so he's had people, scholars within Islam, Judaism, and Christianity respond to it. And basically, I wound up writing the article on the benefits of disagreements, because I disagreed with certain things he was putting forth in the book, and then, talked about why it might actually be good to make sure we're still in conversation and dialogue with people we disagree with. So it's a topic that's very live for me right now. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about it. So that's fascinating. So you've really been in the thick of this for a very long time, and you've seen changes within the discourse. I'd just like to hear more about it. Again, either from your perspective of teaching, from research, from different views of the students you've seen come through it, wherever you think is the best place to engage.
Right. So I guess one other thing that I have come to like appreciate, like having taught this for some years, is that sometimes it's about neither science nor religion, and I think this should be like, I think it's a good way to like preserve the integrity of the field of science and religion, right? Sometimes it's about neither of those, and I think that actually becomes useful. Otherwise, there is a kind of like field imperialism that's very widespread for a lot of things. So like, you pick a theme or like an issue and you say, well, everything is actually about this. I mean, I guess, the basic, like, funny way would be like, everything is political. well, some things are actually like a lot more political than other things, and we should have a way to like distinguish these things, right? And I think it's the same about science and religion. Sometimes it's really about science and religion, but sometimes it isn't. It's about something else altogether. It just seems like there's a projection of this other issue on science and religion, but it's not really about science and religion. And I think that's also like important to recognize. Um, yeah, and I guess
Right,
just
'cause
going on the yeah. I mean, it's sometimes it just isn't.
right.
I look at it. It looks like maybe it's like a science and religion issue, but then on like close inspection, you realize, oh, well, these people don't seem to care about science or about religion, or they don't seem to know very much about either. And this is quite common, and this is something that I also want to understand. I just like I've talked to like a bunch of people about how to go about this. Um, there is a general common apathy about a lot of things, and I think apathy also extends to like science. It also extends to religion, um, without really anyone putting apathy in people's minds, right? So um, people can be just naturally a-religious. They can be naturally a-scientific, and I mean this comes up like with things like say like anti-vaccination campaigns and stuff. Well, yes, there are some people who oppose it on what seems to be a kind of religious reasoning. Well, there are other people who are kind of like, well, I'm suspicious. I'm just I don't really care about this kind of thing. I don't want to do it. Um, no one taught me to be suspicious of vaccines. It's just that in my own mind, I don't care very much. Or like climate change, things like that. So like I also take this parameter of apathy, just quotidian apathy. That's nothing special. I think that also needs to be taken into account when we're like dealing with something like science and religion, because a lot of people don't seem to care about either of those things.
Right. Yeah, there were a few
Yeah,
papers just presented on the vaccines where I feel like they were very much doing what you're saying and arguing that people are sort of trying to say that when religious people have anti-vaccine or vaccine hesitance positions, that it's because of their religious identity. And a lot of these papers were trying to show that wasn't what it was about. It was about lots of
right,
other things. And to say
right.
it was religious was a projection. And yeah, and then sometimes there's sort of a tendency to say almost none of it is about science and religion. It's about power, or it's about cultural identity, or it's about this or that.
Right.
And then you sometimes have the counter pushback. Okay, but there's a little something here about so you sometimes see that push and pull a little bit going on.
Absolutely. And you know what? It takes a scholar of science and religion to see it. And which is, kind of right. So like it might not be all science and religion, but someone who works on science and religion is definitely going to be in an advantageous position to discern when it is and when it is not.
So what do you think are the most exciting issues going on now? Or, again, as you see it in comparison to things that happened over the time that you've been involved in the field, or what other topics would you like to raise sort of for us to think about?
As far as science and religion is concerned, I think intellectualism um, is kind of a strong issue here that needs to be picked up, because so there are more or less intellectual registers in religion. So there are people, right? I mean, there are more or less intellectual registers of approach to science. So some people, they just might have picked up like a few precepts of science or like a few key claims, and might be like beating people over, like just verbally over these kind of like few things that they know. Same with religion. Whereas of course there are people who know a lot of both, and this is something that's, I think, really ripe for investigation. Like just like the different registers of science and religion, because you can have like a whole theologian, like PhD and all, like professor of years, weighing in on a scientific matter. That's obviously not the same as someone who doesn't know very much about either weighing in on it. And this kind of like intellectual stratification, I think, is one of the most interesting things to me. And that's like realizing that, you know, there are like higher and lower registers can actually help us find where the dialogue is and the kind of shape it's going to take, right? So a very sophisticated, very intellectual, devout person is not going to fight, let's say, like a street level like atheist on like issues of religion. They're going to have a much higher level of discourse, and their interlocutors will be a lot more different. And this will also help us like realize, you know, what's like the social aspect of it and what's not the social aspect of it.
Right.
So,
And
like,
of course,
you know,
there's no hard and fast line between religion, culture, and society. So these are all going to be very
yes,
fluid categories of the
yes,
category.
yes, absolutely. And so, you know, it's very helpful to like, you know, to think about registers when we're trying to think about, say, like, okay, I know what like an Oxford theologian said to, like, say, like Richard Dawkins. But does that help me understand, you know, what's happening in the streets of, say, like Birmingham?
Right. And of course,
When
people are
it comes,
getting more and more interested in the everyday. They want to leave the elites and say, okay,
yeah,
that's fine and well to understand, you know, some, you know,
right,
theological or scientific dispute, but how is it getting perceived in the broader public? How are regular
exactly.
people engaging with this? So
Yes, and like I think like especially like social media is very ripe for this. So this is one of the exercises that I asked the students to do in my science and religion class. I asked them to like socially profile. So like I asked them to like find some like atheists or like some religious people who seem to have anti-science sentiments on Twitter or Reddit, and to profile them. So like what kind of people are these? So like, you know, is a militant atheist also vegan, right? How do they feel about feminism and things like that? So like this kind of typological work, I think, might be very helpful. And ultimately, you know, I am also interested in, well, the social history of science and religion rather than the high cultural history of science and religion. I think a lot of us, like, you know, a lot of us who do science and religion by training and by disposition are intellectual historians, and we approach a lot of things as items in intellectual history, whereas for a lot of people it might not be an intellectual matter, strictly speaking. Right, they might not have that kind of aspiration, they might not even have that kind of like concern, and they still might have some stake in like science and religion for other reasons, and I think that would be a wonderful thing to study.
so are you still teaching this course when you're giving these typology social media kind of assignments, or this is something that
No,
you've
it's,
stopped for
yeah,
now?
this is pre-pandemic.
It's on hiatus. Okay.
Yeah, it's on hiatus because, you know, after I picked up this Middle East Center position, I've been teaching only 3 courses per year. I teach a graduate course that has to do with STS methods, generally speaking. I teach Introduction to the History of Science, which is kind of like the big lecture course, and I get 1 undergraduate seminar. And because right now I'm interested in the history of labor, I teach a, you know, science, capital, and labor course, which has been, you know, satisfying. It's not an easy class to teach because there isn't a lot of like literature that's just like available off the shelf. Although, you know, like things are getting published nowadays. But yeah, I mean, once I have the space for it, I might come back to it. But right now, like, you're just like, you know, in my teaching, I don't have the space to look at science and religion.
Right. And you might change your curriculum a little bit from how it had you had previously presented it.
Yes, I think I would. I mean, there are some things that I would probably keep. I mean, for example, you know, really enjoy like getting the students. This is one of the exercises that I did, early Greek philosophy, and I think the students really appreciate that perspective. like if you read, say, something like Thales, right, which had this crazy notion that the world is made of water, um, in conjunction with all the like myths of Genesis that are coming out of that geography at the same time, it kind of makes sense. Like, if you heard all of them, and if you're just like a dude who happened to be in a place like the marketplace, who heard all of that, you might say, well, it seems like everybody is all about water, because you can even read the book of Genesis as like a dark waters to light waters kind of story. Um, that that kind of thing I enjoyed a lot. Like very ancient stuff that I obviously have a very limited knowledge about. But yeah, I think when we approach like the modern period, I might assign like other things. I mean, the truth is, of course, like Darwin is so big. If you want to do like a global reach science and religion course, you really can't uh, skip Darwin. And to do it properly, that's like a 7-week proposition. I need to spend half the semester on Darwin. So let's say I got to play around with ancient stuff for like a week or two, and then I have 7 weeks of Darwin.
Oh,
I
wow.
might play around with those like 5 weeks in between, but I think that's really like all I'd get.
You really give
No
Darwin his
guessing around.
due.
Yeah, well, because there's a lot of like very good literature on like Darwin and Galton and how they have been like received, Spencer, all of these people, and you can really like make a very neat reading list out of those things. But for previous periods, it's a little more difficult. I did another thing that I did, now that we're talking about this, is so I got the students to like read Galileo's letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, and I also made them read some of the decrees of the Council of Trent. And I said, okay, like well, you're a lawyer, which is what the Inquisition is. It's a bunch of lawyers. Would you condemn Galileo or would you not? And how do you feel about that? Because I think in a lot of ways, the punishment that Galileo got was, it legally made sense. It's one of those things where it's like this is like the late medieval debate between like legality and legitimacy, right? So I got the students to like think about those things. Maybe I might keep that. Maybe I might have a better example for that kind of thing.
And you'd bring it up to contemporary issues today.
Yes, because see, modern militant atheism, because it has such a huge media presence, is what gets the students into a course like that. Not all of them, but a lot of them will come in because they have been exposed to like someone like Richard Dawkins or like Daniel Dennett. There are a couple of other people whose names on
The Horseman.
I'm not. Yeah, exactly, right. So they have a lot of like media presence. So I mean, I think it's less now than it was, say, like 2 or 3 years ago. But it's still like atheism, modern militant atheism. Atheists should like organize and like establish their own church, etc., etc. It was like a big thing. And I think this was like one of the key issues they brought up. Like the problem with atheism is that it's not organized, and we should organize, they said. Which is an interesting notion, because like where would you organize? Why would you organize? So is atheism lacking this like critical community aspect that religion has, and things like that? That's very interesting, and I might even like front load something like that, just to get the students like warm up to discussing science and religion.
So everyone left your course. What do you think they got out of your course? You're saying it was a bit of therapy, it was a bit of discussions of how to have civil discourse, a bit of
Right.
No one left totally satisfied, but everyone those were 3 of the takeaways I've had so far. And then
Yes, I think I think that's like good enough. Like to me, like that's more than I can hope to get out of any course.
And what are you working on now? What is your research focus at the moment?
So I am doing a whole bunch of things right now. I'm doing work on history of science and the history of labor, and that's about really how we can approach scientific labor. I mean, you may be familiar with some of these debates. There is a huge push to redistribute credit in scientific work, just to move away from these central scientist figures to look at basically less privileged, less visible individuals in history, to see how they contribute to science. And I think the direction is that the scientist figures that we're talking about are increasingly looking parasitic, just to extend it a little bit to make it striking. And then the question becomes, well, what are these people good for anyway? So what kind of work are they doing? And why are they doing it? So that's kind of something that I'm trying to understand. So is there a specifically scientific kind of work that you can't get if you focus on, say, people who do technical work in a lab, or administrative work in a lab, or maybe they are providing data and information? Does it still come together if you don't have this scientist figure, right? So this is the kind of thing that I'm interested in. That's one. Two, I'm interested in the history of science in the 1930s, because I found that 1930s is really a watershed moment. I mean, there have been there has been a very nice journal special issue recently. People have been writing about 1930s. What I found in the 1930s is that there is a very serious Marxist moment in history of science, and they understand science quite differently. So one thing that comes up, say, repeatedly, is Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci in the 1930s is an important figure in the history of science. We don't study history of Darwin, or excuse me, Da Vinci in history of science programs anymore. It's so vintage, and that's partly because we don't understand science in a way that makes Da Vinci valuable, right? We think, for example, well, I mean, even this is a little vintage right now, but so when I went to grad school, let me put it to you this way, things that might matter in the history of science would be physical sciences, astronomy, cosmology, that kind of thing. Even that's not the case anymore. I think we have a much more biological and medical understanding of modernity these days. But I'm interested in the transition from how did we stop thinking about science as something that's attached to manufacture and mechanism and things like that, and start thinking about it in terms of cosmologies and worldviews and just giant theories of physics and astronomy. And that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out. So I'm basically canvassing everything that was written in the 1930s that's related to the history of science. And I'm also trying to understand, how it all works with the Great Depression, 1929. Something happened. Everybody got struck by it. People were thinking about it, but then it disappears. Especially after World War II, we no longer speak about the psychological effects of the Great Depression on how we understand science. So that's the moment that I'm trying to recover. So if you were in the 1930s, if you were living through the thick of the Great Depression, where a lot of people were actually blaming scientists for taking jobs away, etc. I'm trying to recover that moment, that sentiment about science that was in the 1930s. That's another thing that I'm doing. And something that's kind of trailing a little behind, which I'm also interested in, is the temporal regime of science. Because I mean, the way science as a profession works right now it's extremely quick, right? It's about semesters and years and 3-year grants, 5-year grants, etc., etc. Whereas, of course, there's something about science that goes way beyond this, right? You do something as a young person, and then you get a Nobel Prize for it when you're 80, 90 years old, right? So there is a huge set of temporal regimes that play in science, and that's another thing that I'm trying to understand. But I'm just starting out, so like I don't have very much to say about that, except it's puzzling that so much science today is done on like short-term research budgets and things like that, whereas I guess the most significant scientific advancements, if you will, that we make are they flourish over extremely long periods of time, sometimes more than a lifetime. And in that sense, this also ties in with the question of religion, right? Who thinks about the future in such like huge chunks, in like, well, what's going to happen in 50 years, 100 years? It's almost like thinking about your afterlife. So that's
and how does
something
the
else
new
that I'm
open science trends affect this, in terms of also some of the other questions you were talking about as well, in terms of there being even more collaboration than ever, in
right.
terms of either data collection or things along those lines? Yeah, I mean, I know that's connecting a few of your different topics that you were talking about, but yeah, I was really interested. So do you have more reflections on that transition you're describing in the 1930s from the more mechanistic towards the worldviews and the cosmological or things like that? I mean, I know for decades people have pointed to the world wars as transitions in these things, also in terms of
Right.
the use of science of the atom bomb, suddenly having many different negative perceptions of science or things along those lines. But yeah, three fascinating projects. I don't know what more you can share with us now on one foot on any of them, but really, really amazing.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's they're all in progress. They will bear fruit soon. But yeah, I mean, I can't say like I can't say until like I'm good and ready to say like I to say something. Yeah,
You're just researching
I'm
them all in parallel right now.
exactly, and I mean I know in my mind somewhere that these are all connected. I just haven't figured out how.
You're gonna find that point.
Right. I mean, that's usually like how it is with me. Like I really admire people who can chart out a research project and just do it. Um, whereas for me, like I'm like deaf, blind, and I'm just like kind of like fumbling around. I don't even know what I'm looking for until I find it.
You're just
Right.
hanging
That's
out in the
usually
archives, or what kind of materials are you looking at for these projects?
um so a lot of things that were like meant to be read by human beings, which is very refreshing. It's quite different from like doing uh earlier history. So it's I'm reading like articles and books, obviously, that were written in the 1930s. I'm looking at things like pamphlets, and this is another thing. So I think for a very long time, our profession, that is being an academic, um, didn't really think that we were working in a strict sense, which is why a lot of people have been like reluctant to say like unionize as academics. That's obviously changing. That's been changing, I would say, since maybe 1980, maybe since the beginning of the 21st century. But for a while, like the understanding was like unionization, workers' rights, things like that were actually for like lower class people who weren't academics. Um, but if you go back to the 1930s, labor is such a front and center aspect of the scientific and the academic profession more generally. There are pamphlets about this, like scientific labor. What is it? Who does it, and things like that. So I also find that parallel like interesting, because right now we are, without doubt, in a labor crisis in the academy. And one way to understand it may be to like go back to the 1930s, when people were also thinking about these things. But yeah, so like 1930s labor time. I mean, I again, like they hang together somehow. I just haven't figured out how.
Wow. Okay, great. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. I don't know if there's any final thoughts you want to leave people with, in terms of, again, theoretically, it's a community of scholars. Is science and religion even a field? It's hard to say, because obviously people are coming from so many disciplines. They have so many
Right.
different foci. So there's always the question of, what are we all doing together and talking about?
Right.
And even yourself, you were talking about how you came from certain historical directions, and now
Right.
you don't even see yourself necessarily in the same way of how you started your own career. So I don't know if you have any
Right.
advice or reflections or thoughts to
Well, I mean,
end.
advice, like I don't even have advice for myself. So like I would say like science and religion to me has always been an interesting conversation. And I think that's what I would put front and center. I don't know if it's a field, we obviously don't have very many like science and religion departments. I don't know how many like named like science and religion positions in departments even, but I think it's a very good conversation. It's always been a good conversation, and I think it will continue to be a good conversation for a long time to come. It's just that yeah.
And of course, this network in particular is focusing on the Middle East and North Africa. You're sitting in Turkey right now. I'm sitting here in Jerusalem right now. I don't know if you think that our particular region has anything in, any certain contributions that you think are important right now to that conversation, so to speak, or if you see it more globally, or how the different regional aspects affect the international conversation.
So for one, I think history of science in the Muslim context and in the Jewish context has always had an attachment to religion. That is, when you have a Jewish scientist, it's a Jewish scientist, right? Not just a scientist, but a Jewish scientist. And something similar goes with the case of Islam. If you're a Muslim scientist, you're a Muslim scientist and not just a scientist. So there is kind of this adjectival quality to religion in our region that you may not always find in other places. So you don't think of Darwin as a Christian scientist. He's just a plain scientist,
the
right?
Default.
So, and I think there's the default, vanilla, which of course vanilla is a very strong flavor. You would find out very quickly, if you had something without vanilla. But so it's not vanilla, right? So religion is always there. You always have to deal with it, for better or for worse. And I think just getting to the bottom of it, why in these places there is this adjectival quality to religion. I think that's really a worthwhile question to ask. And I think, again, science and religion scholars are in an excellent position to ask why that is.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your conversation, and your 3 current projects sound fascinating. And of course, if you ever get back to teaching that science and religion course, I want to know how you're going to update it. If you're going to start with COVID questions, or how what your new lead-ins will be. So it was great having this time together today, and I hope to hear more about your work in the future.
Thank you. I really appreciate the conversation, and wonderful seeing you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.